Listen, baby, it won't get weird.
That sounds weird.
Too late.
Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. This episode is sponsored by Harvest. I used Harvest to track time, track subcontractors' time, and invoice clients. Their time tracking is really simple and easy to use. Invoicing includes a Pay Now function by credit card and PayPal, and you can sign up at getharvest.com. Use the code RF to get 50% off your first month. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 28 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you live from the second story of an office space in Orem, Utah.
We also have Jamison Dance.
Hi, I'm Jamison Dance. I'm super excited because today ITV just announced that we're doing the Nintendo TV thing, and I haven't been able to talk about it for like 6 months, so it's a good day.
Cool. We also have Joe Eames.
Coming at you semi-live from American Fork, Utah.
And I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Tim's not with us Tim's not with us this week because he is in China. I thought I'd point that out because I think it's cool. Anyway, this week we're going to be talking about Greenfield versus Brownfield projects. It was kind of funny when we were getting ready to do this. Some of the panelists were like, what? Green, brown?
Yeah, I have to pull a Josh Susser and ask for a definition.
So, as far as I understand it, there are some nuances to this depending on who you talk to, but mostly Greenfield is a brand new project with few or no decisions made and no code written for it yet. And Brownfield projects are effectively older applications, usually associated with legacy code. So it's an application that already has code written toward it and typically is out there in the world doing whatever it is it's supposed to do.
Now, I want to put this question delicately. Are there any fecal connotations to the color brown in Brownfield?
Only if it's PHP.
Then it's Poopfield Development.
Okay, we're not going to go down that tangent.
Because, honestly, when Mormons make jokes about crap, it never sounds good anyway.
Yeah. So, anyway, how many of you guys have actually worked on a real Greenfield project? Like, been there from day one that you haven't just built yourself?
So I guess it depends on your definition. Okay. Maybe. So we have lots of services at ITV, so I've been part of just spinning up completely new services that didn't exist. But there was still, we had other sort of similar things already. So some of the decisions were already made for us. So we kind of had a style established. But it was still like a separate project.
Do you forget us so soon, Jamison? you don't remember ever working here or...
I do. I don't remember Greenfield stuff. I remember new features, but not complete. We were building off existing code. Or do I misremember?
Well, what about the map? Tell me.
Yeah, that was a feature on top of an existing code base. It wasn't like a whole new project. It was just a whole new feature.
If you can't tell, folks, that was a bad breakup.
Oh. No,
it was a good breakup.
We still hug every time we see each other.
Yeah, we do. I love Jamison.
So, Joe, I'm a little curious if you would count a new web service inside of an existing ecosystem, a Greenfield project.
Well, I think that really raises one of the more interesting questions about Greenfield versus Brownfield development, which is, your description, things where there's been no decision is green, and things where the code base is older is brown. Well, I think that leaves out a big, huge chunk, which is probably what most people work on, which is, projects that are being built, but decisions have been made, and now you're in the middle of that and dealing with ramifications of the decisions that were made and all the code that's been written, and then still trying to build upon it. So services, definitely, services inside of a bigger project like what Jamison was talking about, where you've actually already made some decisions, I think falls inside that category. So is that green or is that brown? That's
a good question. For me, I don't know. It's hard because, you come into a Greenfield project, but you come in at a later stage. Is it still Greenfield? I don't know.
Right.
So if you mix green and brown, you get like
camouflage
still, basically. Well, camouflage. Yeah. Okay. So
maybe that's it.
It's Greenfield,
we're coining it.
And camouflage
field development.
Yeah.
Camo field.
You have a problem where no one can see your projects.
Right.
So, where some decisions have been made, but some haven't, right? That's an interesting place to be, where you can make decisions still, where you're not just refactoring or bug fixing legacy code, but you're building. And that's a really interesting place to be. And I think that's where most people live the majority of their coding lives is in that realm.
Right. That makes sense. It's I think some of it just depends on the developer as well. I mean, if you're the person kind of making the decisions as you go along, then it may feel more like a Greenfield project, where if you are being exposed to code that somebody else is writing and making the decisions on, then it's probably more of a Brownfield project for you.
That's actually a really good point. To some people, every project they work on is a Greenfield project, because every decision that's been made can be thrown out and made their way.
Yes and no. I think to a certain degree you're probably right, but to another degree I have to say that it seems to me that at a certain point you're dealing with the older app, the ecosystem that you've built. And so even when you're adding new features and you're making new decisions, you're still dealing with the legacy code that's already there.
Yeah.
So here, I was the third person to come on. So the only code that had been written, like application code, was written by electrical engineers. It was not the best code. Of course, not to say that my code is the best code, but it was better.
Having been an electrical engineering major, ouch.
Well, anyway, so I had the luxury of kind of being able to take command, and everybody that came on after me. So the whole software team has kind of got a little bit of my footprint in it, and it's been it was fun to be able to throw away the crappy code and redo it, but it took a long time.
Right. So how do you deal with the legacy code? How do you manage that stuff? Like what's your approach, AJ? You come in, you find a code base that isn't beautiful, and you want to make it maintainable and solve some of the problems that are there. What do you do?
Well, I think there's two kind of approaches. One is get the existing code to be more like the API that you want it to be externally, whatever little pieces it's going to have to interact with. And the other is the opposite way around. Build some new code the way that you want it to be, but then put like a shim layer in there that interfaces in the backward way.
Okay. So basically you maintain the API and you just make you basically add a translation layer to the more usable code.
Yeah, so as you refactor, just keep those stubs for the backward stuff in there until you're done with the refactor, and then when everything's working, you pull it out.
Yep. I think Joe and I will agree that there's something else that you should do with your legacy code as you refactor it.
Document it?
It's a type of documentation.
Yeah.
It's a guessing game. Okay, I know this one. Hungarian notation for your variables.
Getting warmer.
Yeah, you should put tests around it so at least characterization tests so you know what it does. And then from there you can modify it without worrying about whether or not you've made critical changes to the API or critical changes to the results that you get out of it.
So there's this excellent book written by Michael Feathers called Working Effectively with Legacy Code, where he talks through the process of adding, basically being able to change legacy code. And I don't know how many of you guys have had this experience. I'm sure Chuck has, of being on a project where you got this large portion of the code, if not all the code, that you're just afraid to touch because you have no idea what might break in the entire system if you touch one piece of code because of how coupled the code might be. And so in those extreme, this book has techniques that work all the way from those really extreme circumstances all the way down to just, hey, we wrote this 6 months ago, but we want to make some changes and we just don't have it fresh in our minds anymore. And so it's a process of adding tests around your code. And he has all kinds of methods to deal with, even the worst, least testable type of code in the least testable types of languages in that book. It's an excellent book if you're working with very brownfield type development and code that you're afraid to touch.
Yeah, I have to point out, you said that I've probably had projects like that. I just want to correct you. I've built projects like that. Where you have that section of code and every time you try and add something to it, something else breaks.
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh, how do I get out of this mess?
So yeah. I've read part of that book, not the whole thing. I can only make it halfway through a book and then I have to start a new one. It's a bad habit.
Me
but
too.
He has an interesting definition where he says that legacy code is just code that isn't under test.
Right.
So
I agree with that.
That's kind of an extreme position, I think, but
we all know extreme is better. It's like the Doritos.
That's true. Yeah, Mountain Dew has taught me that extreme is better. So
yeah.
What I really meant to say is that's a better position. But
it's funny that you say that it's an extreme position because it sounds like you're saying that it might be a little bit too far down the spectrum.
I am a testing skeptic. I have lots of guilt about it because I don't do it as much as I should. But so maybe I'm skeptical about it to make myself not feel as guilty.
Yeah, because I tend to see it the other way, and I'm not sure it goes far enough because I've seen code under test that I would call legacy code. And it's not just because the tests weren't up to snuff. The code is just ugly. It's hard to work with.
Right. So we had an interesting experience here at Domo. I brought like 5 of the front-end engineers with me off to the Utah Software Craftsmanship User Group. And for a lot of them, it was their first exposure to a group of people that were, heavy believers in pair programming and test-driven development and, all the typical agile practices and refactoring to patterns and things like that. And
Joe, I just want to let you know that you can come here when you've had your time there. Just side note.
Thanks. So it was a very interesting experience because there's these 5 guys that showed up and then their thoughts afterwards about, test-driven development and code craftsmanship. And, for people that haven't drunk the Kool-Aid, really done some good test-driven development for a long time, paired for a while, it's funny because you just don't see the benefits the first hour, and those it gives you benefits in scenarios that just can't be covered by a tutorial that has code so simple that people can understand it in a single article. But when you get into something big and heavy, and all of a sudden your tests are just saving your life, and the other guy sitting next to you that's patching the code that you're writing is, keeping you from making mistake after mistake that's, that pays off 6 months from now and 8 months from now, not tomorrow, but pays off, down the road. That's when, you get those benefits and you get the people that really truly understand and believe how beneficial those things are. And that's one of the hard things to do is to teach somebody if they don't spend 6 months doing it, I don't think they have an easy time seeing the benefits. You can talk about it all day long, but it's hard to see. So I agree heartily with Michael Feather's definition that legacy code is code without tests, code that's not under test.
So I had a thought while you were talking, and that's how conservative. So if you're doing a Greenfield project where someone has an idea of what they want made, but it's not really decided how it gets made, how conservative or crazy should you be with your technology choices? Relative to your own experience. So should you start up a new project using like some framework you've never done before because you heard it was cool? Like, how do you decide how much new stuff to use or how to just use the same thing already that you've already used?
So that is a good question. And I think it's going to vary for each of us. I'm just going to start it off because as a freelancer, obviously, I want to make the less risky choices.
You don't want to do resume-driven development? Where you pick the coolest things so it looks really good on your resume?
If I do, I'm going to build a few projects of my own in it first before I go and try and sell it to a client. And
that's amazingly responsible of you, Chuck.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, right? Is they're paying me a premium to be an expert in whatever it is I'm doing, and so I should be choosing technologies that will give them the most value. And so that's kind of the way that I feel. If you're in a situation where somebody is dictating the technology to you in one way or another, either it has to be able to handle this kind of traffic or these kinds of requests or things like that, then sometimes you can get away with picking a technology that looks cool that meets the requirements. But I mean, for the most part, that's not the case. I think if you're in a corporation and things like that, and they're satisfied with the risk, then you can take more risks. So I don't know if you guys have a different take on that, being employed at companies as opposed to being employed by clients.
What do you think, AJ?
So I don't know. I'm kind of a bad person to ask because I came into a startup company as the third person. So I just picked stuff that I liked and I said, let's run with this. And some of those choices turned out to be good and some of them, have their drawbacks. So, I mean, like professionally, I'm not quite as old as you guys. Well, I'm not quite as old as you guys anyway.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for that.
Maturity.
Exactly. So,
next time I see you, I'm going to run you with my rascal.
Into your what?
With my rascal.
What's a rascal?
You know, little powered chairs that you see your grandparents in?
Dude, I'm not that old.
Enough to know what those are, Joe.
Yeah. So anyway, I've kind of, in most of the jobs where I've been able to kind of start new things. I mean, that's one of the things that's very interesting to me. So that's what I look for. My first job at BYU, I had to work a lot with legacy code. And one of the terrible things about working at a university, I would imagine at most universities, is that it's people who don't know what they're doing, picking up code that someone else worked on for 6 months, who didn't know what they were doing, whose professor didn't know what he was doing because he's never worked in the field, but he's got a PhD,
This sounds very familiar.
But then in terms of real jobs, like I've always been in a position where I've had that opportunity. So anyway, I would value your opinions. I mean, you guys have done freelancing and working around, so answer the same question.
Go ahead, Chuck.
Chuck already answered it.
Yeah, I already answered it. What do you think, Jamison?
I think you have to take risks somewhere, but it just depends on the downside. That's a really vague, hand-wavy answer. So if you're working on something that is like mission critical, makes your company tons of money, you probably want to be a little more conservative. If you're doing something that is like helpful and useful and cool, I mean, hopefully you wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't helpful to your company. But I mean, you kind of have to pick your projects that you're more able to experiment on, I guess. So I do it sometimes, but on smaller projects.
Right.
I think that a lot of what is important when answering this question is gaining exposure to technologies so that you can make wise decisions. Like, there are times when even on a mission critical piece, you can choose the wrong thing because what you're comfortable with just doesn't cover the domain space well. And I'll give you an example. A company I know of was doing a chat client, a web chat client, and they wrote the server in C. And that's because that was what the engineer knew. So he wrote this. He wrote an actual web server in C from scratch.
Oh man,
yeah,
that's fun actually.
I mean, it would be an interesting project. Don't get me wrong, but there are things out there that already do the job and do it better than what you can write in a few months.
Right. Yeah. So think of the maintenance costs with something that's it's a solved problem somewhere. So if you knew about Node. And most people consider Node to be very bleeding edge. Most companies won't allow any production code like Domo here. We're a fairly forward-thinking company, and even now we still don't have any production code that runs in Node. But that's just an obvious superior choice. So even if you're a C programmer, you don't know a thing about Node, I got to say that I think at that point it's a mistake to say I'm going to write this in C and not to just pick up and learn Node. It's not that hard.
I totally agree with you there. It is. I mean, there's just not even Ruby is as simple for the networking and HTTP stuff as Node is.
Yeah.
Well, I think ultimately what we're talking about here is risk. And so if there is more risk in going and trying new technology, and you have to do at least some research in order to know that, then don't do it. But if there's less risk, you go out and you figure out, okay, Node does these kinds of things really, really well, then there's more risk in sticking with what you know than there is with taking some time to learn Node.
Right.
And I think the other piece is that usually we're building software for stakeholders other than ourselves. And so if that's the case, then we need to be able to accurately represent to them, hey, look, this is the direction we're going to head in. This is why we're going to do it. And this is the overhead that it's going to generate. And that way they understand the decision and they understand why the trade-off is actually a favorable one.
Yeah. And so kind of going back to that point about exposure, if you don't understand the technologies that are out there and what they're good at and what they're not good at, then you can't make that decision. So exposure is I think it's an important part of being a professional developer is even if you don't work in Node and you don't think you'll ever work in Node, at least spend enough time to understand why people are using it so that when the perfect project for that comes along, you know why people are using it. MVC frameworks are another good example. There's 8 of them and they're practically clones of each other for many respects. So if you know one well, you're probably not making a poor decision by using it instead of another one.
Right.
So, but one well, if you've just been doing JavaScript, you've never been doing an MVC framework, and now you realize you're going to be building your first piece in JavaScript that's bigger than 60 lines of code, and you're worried about maintaining the code and organizing the code, and you don't know anything at all about MVC frameworks, then you're not fulfilling your responsibilities as a developer to your employer, in my opinion.
I agree. At the same time, I think they should also be providing you with the opportunity to learn those things, even if they aren't directly applicable to the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah, that's another thing. Seek out the companies that serve you as well as you serve your company. So if you're the type of guy that really wants to stay abreast because that will serve your company, look for a company that supports you in that.
So I have a theory about that. There are some people that are really into learning new things, and they're going to do it whether you let them or not. And if you don't let them, then they're going to do it on production stuff. So there's a lot of value in letting people, either giving them like developer time, 20% time, stuff like Google does, or training or whatever, or being open to doing crazy stuff on production code.
Right.
So,
and
Bob,
go ahead.
I was going to say Bob Martin has a book, The Clean Coder, where he talks a lot about professionalism. One of the things that he states, in his opinion, is you give a good quality 40 hours to your company, and then you spend another 20 hours afterwards sharpening your axe and honing your skills. And so he kind of takes the responsibility off the company to do that. Now, I think the company should support you with, paying for educational materials and conferences and things like that. I think that's the mark of a good company. But I also agree with Bob Martin that, there's just not enough time. 20% time would be really nice, and most companies don't provide that. But I think there's just not enough time. You should be doing stuff on your own to stay abreast, of what's going on.
I completely agree. It's just that if the companies understand the value in that, then they should be willing to invest in it. Now, if they're not going to, then absolutely, ultimately it's your responsibility to train yourself up and, learn what it is that you need to learn in order to do your job.
Yeah, here in Utah, there's like less than 1% unemployment in software developers. And so every time I meet a software developer that's stuck at his job and can't get a new job, I just shake my head because you almost have to work hard to make your skill set so obsolete that you can't go find another job in a week.
That's so true.
Yeah, there's definitely a good market around here.
Yeah.
It's so hard to find people because there's so many companies vying for the same group.
Yeah. And there are places in the world and in the country where that's not true, where you're in smaller towns that only have so many places that pay for developers. So it can be less true in other places, but I'd say the majority of the country, being in software development is a really good field to be in, and it's not hard to find jobs if you keep your skill set up. And if you don't, you're killing yourself. You're killing your future. You got to keep up.
Well, the other thing is that I bet you guys can guess how many of my clients are actually local clients. None. None of them. None of them are local. And so even though the market is so good here for developers, there's a ton of remote work out there, just gobs of it, in just about any technology you care to work in too. And so, it's not unheard of for people to, find the work that they want and not even have to leave home to go do it.
Right.
But anyway, we're kind of getting off on a tangent here.
Here we are.
So what kind of decisions do you make when you're going after a Greenfield project? What decisions do you find yourself making, Joe?
Well, obviously, just the actual toolkit that we're going to use is a big one. And it's nice. I think another nice thing about Greenfield development is it's tolerant to more risk. So that's the time when you can look and say, well, I hear that this particular tool, this particular framework, these particular libraries are better at this than things that I've used in the past. So for this Greenfield, we're going to start here. But
right, because you don't have to refactor around the existing code.
But I think another important decision to make when you're doing Greenfield development is right from the start, put your engineering practices into place, put together your continuous deployment, put together your continuous integration, put together your automated unit tests, and so that you don't have to pay that pain sometime later on. So that's another decision that's made right up from the front is what engineering practices are you going to embrace in your development, and then on top of that, merging the two is if you're going to choose, jQuery or whatever. Try abstracting, your toolkit choices, your framework choices as much as possible so that if it turns out you made a mistake, especially when you're trying something new and you're not 100% sure, as much as possible try to abstract it inside of, put another layer between your code and that code. So if you have to swap it out for something else, then you can. Mood tools and jQuery, I believe, are really, really comparable in feature set. And it's not hard to write an abstraction layer around that so that you can jerk jQuery out and put Mood tools in if you so find that just jQuery isn't working out for you.
Yeah, absolutely true. It reminds me a little bit of the Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests. Have you read that?
Yeah.
And they talk about all that stuff where you set up your continuous integration, you set up your deployment, you actually test it and you make sure that it all works as part of getting started in your in your new project. And it just makes a lot of sense to me because then you know exactly what your constraints are before you really start making the big decisions that are going to kill you later on.
Right.
So with Brownfield projects, let's say that it is legacy code and that it's not tested. Do you pretty much follow the prescriptions that Michael Feathers lays out where you write a characterization test, then you refactor the code and, put more unit tests in as you go?
My experience has been that's more up to the tolerance in the company that I work for. To really, if they have a real will to fix their technical debt issues, or if they don't, that determines whether or not if they do, then yeah. We have a funny situation going, an interesting situation going on here at Domo that's very applicable to this. We have a large set of untested client-side code written in Backbone, just kind of plain Backbone. And as we all know, Backbone is so unopinionated that, every developer's version of Backbone is entirely different. So we've got, 30 versions of Backbone implementation written, and all this code that's just definitely less maintainable. It's not terrible, but it's bad enough that it's causing issues. So we started an internal project to just migrate the client-side code over to something cleaner. We've been writing a new framework based on Marionette to do that, and we're starting to have at least the primary engineer on that, who's not me, is starting to have some second thoughts about, we're kind of taking this Greenfield approach where we've created a new framework and a new structure, and then we have to migrate feature by feature from the old code and the old structure into the new structure. And he's worried that the company is just going to get like a third of the way into that and then be too driven on building new features. They're going to leave it, and then it's going to be worse because now there's two ways of doing it. Even though the old way sucks, it's going to suck even more because there's still the old way and all its variations, plus now one more way, the new way.
Yeah, it's super hard when you're trying to refactor and provide new features at the same time.
Yeah.
Wait, we did that. How did that happen, AJ? Didn't we? Because there was like this whole huge rewrite of lots of back-end stuff while I was there, but we were also adding new features.
So this is not a V2.0. This is, like a V1.1, right? Where you're trying to, and you're just cleaning up technical debt. What do you guys do? What would you guys do in that situation?
So again, keeping API compatibility or little shims in place is what's been important for me. And then continuing to add tests. Definitely.
Yeah, I really want to drive that home because the only way that you're going to know that your shim API is compatible is through the test. So that's just something to be aware of. But yeah, I really do like that approach where you can maintain the API and then, maybe maintain a new API and the old API until you have the chance to phase out whatever system you're going to be implementing on the new application. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and then obviously you want to provide an abstraction layer in both pieces of code as quickly as possible where the areas that you have to add new features so that you can easily bring the new features over. So like wherever it is that you have to add new features, that's the place where you got to work first, because otherwise when you go to merge in the new features, then conflicts and crap.
Right.
So let me kick in what my input was as we started going through this process. The primary engineer is starting to, worry about what's going to happen. And this is after a conversation that I had with a local developer here who's a really strong software engineer. And
Can I ask who that is?
Yeah, David Adsit.
Okay.
Yeah, he's very active in the local software craftsmanship user group and a big blogger over at pluralsight.com. Anyway, the input that I'm giving is that we should go with the Greenfield in this situation, because if you do Brownfield, we have funny issues like we're using AMD, but people are relying on the global jQuery and global backbone instance, so they're not actually declaring it as a dependency because it's been potentially modified and it had, like for jQuery had add-ons put in that now their code relies on it, and just funny things like that. So there's these pieces of the code that in order to fix, we'd have to change something that would touch all the code across the entire board. And so you go through, if you change those things, now you have to do a full regression test on the entire site to know that change was right. And you always want to make your changes incrementally. You don't want to just sit down and say, well, we're just going to spend, a month, clean up the old code, and we're not going to check it in or see if it works until the end of that month. That's a failed practice. So you got to do it incrementally. But if you do it Brownfield, where you try to clean up just pieces at a time, you have to regression test the entire system. So instead, if you migrate feature at a time, then now you only have to regression test that feature. Even if you have your unit tests in place, you still have to manually walk through a feature to truly know that it's correct. Unit tests are not an assurance of 100% correctness. So after you migrate the feature over, you only have to regression test that feature to make sure that feature still works. And the risk of breaking the rest of the code because you're moving code into something new is very minimized. And so that was that's my feedback, is to go with the Greenfield anyway, because it lets you know that what you're doing is correct. Whereas in Brownfield, it's risky to, in these two approaches, I'm calling them green and brown. They're not really that clear, but it's just risky to try to touch something that might affect a large percentage of your application and might break it, and then have to regression test over and over and over again. That cost of regression testing, because it has to be manual, is just too high.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about API compatibility and regression testing and making incremental changes. It feels so I'm working on a project right now that is a lot fuzzier than that. There's an external server API that's really simple, but there's lots of changes to make in the client side code, because it's organized in just basically script tags that get put in the head, right? And changing that to a module system isn't something you can do incrementally. Like, you have to do it all at once or it'll just break, right? So what about stuff like that, where it's something that will take some effort and you can't do it incrementally?
So I'm a little bit curious about the implementation you've got there, because I would argue that when you have the script tags, you can still put in a little bit of a shim, so that's incremental. Like, you can have your require function have access to the globals, and then start replacing the assumed global with requires one at a time until they're all up there or something like that. So tell me a little bit more about that.
That actually makes sense. I guess I just didn't think it through very well. So you're saying that you could convert all the code to individual modules, but you wouldn't use the require.js require function. You would make the require thing just look in the global variables. It's kind of like what Tim talked about a couple weeks ago with your own require syntax. Is that, or with your own little define function module loader thing? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So you could still use require.js or browserify or pack manager or whatever, right? But then you just put in a script that right after that runs overwrites the require function, does some composition, so that if it doesn't work the way you want it to already, then it will search in the globals, and that when it does the define or the provide, that it also exports whatever you need out to a global as well. And then you can have your code work both ways.
Sure, that makes sense.
And then, so you just hunt down the places in the code where you've got the globals little by little, one script file at a time, until all of the code or all of the globals have been replaced with requires, and then you take out the shim and then test to see if it works. And then you do the build process and test to see if it works.
Right. So I'm going to change the subject here, unless there's something else that we want to riff on with what we're talking about.
No, that was a pretty awkward silence.
I would like to stick in one little comment about that, and that is, lots of times you can do incremental approaches if you start really thinking a little bit outside of the box. I'm kind of defeating my own argument here when I said, do the Greenfield because the Brownfield has these higher risks, in our situation. And we've thought about certainly some out of the box situations to try to make some of these incremental changes, incremental and safe. So there certainly is times when you think that things are hard, but if you think a little outside of the box, you can actually find ways to make them incremental. But I think that comes down to horizontal changes that affect a large percentage of your code base. If you can not make those and instead make vertical changes where you fix a feature at a time, one piece at a time, and basically what it comes down to is making changes to your code that are likely to only affect a small portion of the code rather than a very cross-cutting concern.
Right.
If If you can do that, then that's better. Much, much, much better.
But it sounds like what you and AJ are both saying is that if you are sneaky enough, if you are clever enough, you can find some way to do changes incrementally, even if it doesn't seem like you can at first.
Well, I mean, it's nice to say that, but there's just definitely situations where that's just not true.
Yep.
You got to try as hard as you can, but you're gonna find some situations. There's no rule. I mean, this isn't like, hey, every recursive algorithm can be built in a non-recursive way. This isn't like that rule. This is, you can say most of the time, and probably more times than people realize that's true, but certainly not every time. There are times when just you have something foundational that it's just so hard. But if looking at, like, say, switching from Backbone to one of the other MVC frameworks, you think, oh, well, we've got to tear it out. It's got to be this big, huge thing that we touch every piece of the code at once. It doesn't have to be. There are ways out there to play on the same page with Backbone and other MVC frameworks, and they can play together at the same time. You can slowly migrate pieces, even of a single page application from Backbone to something else, and vice versa. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So one other topic that I want to cover is that sometimes you get into Brownfield projects and you look at it and, the joke is always about the big rewrite, right? But, when is the big rewrite the correct answer? When do you decide, okay, this would be much easier as a whole if we went ahead and turned it into a Greenfield project?
I think the easiest answer to that is when you can convince the business that it's the right answer. And it's not always just a technical question.
When it hasn't been written 3 times.
I mean, there's certain times, like if you were dealing with an ASP application, or an old really legacy technology, something that's been around for 10 years, and you just want to replace the technology, that's certainly a good candidate for the big rewrite.
Well, yeah, but if you're replacing the core technology, you're probably going to have to anyway.
Right. Although there are ways to do that with ASP and ASP.NET. There's ways to make them play inside the same website, and it's hard. There are ways to do that, and that incremental approach is safer. So Bob Martin, Uncle Bob, is on record as saying, never make the big rewrite. Never make version 2.0. Always incrementally fix. And he's talked about situations where, they've taken 20-year-old systems that were, embedded systems running on crazy machines and rewritten them in current, Python type stuff, and they still did it in an incremental manner.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the old Joel Spolsky article. I have no idea how to say his name. Lots of S's and P's, and that guy. Anyways, his article about the Netscape rewrite and how that killed them because it allowed Microsoft time to create Internet Explorer and eat their lunch, and so he's also on the record about never ever completely rewrite your code.
Right. Yeah, there's
Are there any counterexamples of people who have done complete rewrites from scratch and had wild success?
I can't think of any. I mean, even like Dig did a big rewrite and switched over to Cassandra and a bunch of stuff. And
yeah, but Dig was dead before they did that rewrite.
They were close, but that just finished them off because then they were focused on the rewrite and not on actually making awesome software.
I can't think of any examples.
I can't either, honestly.
That right there is pretty telling. Very telling.
So are we saying that it's never, I hate using absolutes, almost never appropriate to do a complete rewrite?
Probably less often than most people think, I would say. If you think that you need the rewrite, that's like code smell. That's a smell. And you should really, really look closer at that if you think that you need a rewrite.
So I think to be fair, I think you can say that when you're done, the code will end up looking nothing like how it started, but you're not doing that by throwing it away,
right,
and recreating the system from scratch. Like, you could replace every single line of code in your application so that there's none of the old code. But doing it incrementally is safer than throwing it all away and rebuilding the app from scratch.
Right.
Depends on what it is. I would argue that sometimes it's better just to scratch it and start it over.
Certainly size of the application makes a big difference too. If you're talking about 1 man month versus, 1,000, then 1 man month is a lot safer, just throw everything away.
Yeah.
So size makes a big difference too.
Yeah.
But who wants to put on their resume that they were the lead architect on a project that just got canceled 6 months in because it failed because, as developers, we got to consider what the business is likely to do, If you tell the business we're going to rewrite this in 6 months and, you're lying to yourself as well as them that it's an 18-month rewrite, then, you're killing your business, you're killing yourself. You don't want that on your resume. Agreed. Make the
So that's why you don't put that part on your resume.
You put led comprehensive rewrite of project without the canceled part.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, we went through some of that, and honestly, I wish that at one of the companies I worked for anyway, and I wish now that we had actually done something like that, where we had just sat down and said, okay, we're gonna move this piece off and decouple it from everything else and just make it happy. Because I think we would have gotten way further ahead by doing that. So,
well, and it also teaches you a lot of skills about keeping your code decoupled that you're just not to have. No code stays Greenfield for very long. It gets Brownfield really quick, and if you don't know how to manage Brownfield code and incrementally change it, through techniques like some of the things we talked about before, you're doing yourself. If everything is, I can only code if I can start from scratch, make every decision fresh, and not have to deal with any previous decisions and previous code, then you're going to have a hard time finding jobs that will let you do that all the time.
Yep, absolutely. All right, are there any other aspects of this that we want to talk about before we wrap this up? Because we're about to where we need to do picks.
Let's put a bow on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Star guy, shiny gold star.
All right, then we'll have AJ start us off with picks.
All right, I actually had some picked out beforehand today. So, first off, I've been reading this book called Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, and it is about the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the 1830s, Joseph Smith. And it's a very interesting book because it's like a lot of material that you come across about Mormonism and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is, based on proving that it's true or proving that it isn't true. And this book's really nice because it doesn't really consider whether or not it's true. It just says, these are the facts. Like, this is what Joseph Smith did. This is what the other members of the early church did. And these are the things that happened. And it doesn't have that like, oh, we need to prove that it's true or we need to prove that it isn't. It's just historical. And so I really like that. It's been very interesting to get a lot of times you get that kind of fairy tale perspective of, oh, he was a perfect person who set up the church and was just great and everything, and then the other side of that is that he was a terrible person who stole away young women to marry them, and but this is just very, simple and it seems accurate and complete, and I like it. Anyway, another thing, Roll Up Crepes on State Street in Orem. Cool place to hang out, especially on Tuesday night. They have an open mic night. Went there for the first time, kind of by accident, and it was a chill place. So thumbs up to them. And then I just found out about this website, Calepin.co, and it's a Dropbox Markdown blog. So you take Markdown files, you put them in a Dropbox folder, and then it's you go back to that site and you click publish on it, and it turns it into a blog for you, and you can do the CNAME host thing, so you can have your own domain and have it look like it's being hosted on your own domain, even though it's hosted there. But I like the simplicity of you just throw markdown files in a folder. I really don't like WordPress and some of these other ones because you have to put it in their system and then it's locked in their system and it's some ugly HTML that's really difficult to edit afterwards.
Awesome. All right. Jamison, what are your picks?
So a couple weeks ago, I watched a movie called Bernie. It's with Jack Black and Matthew McConaughey. So it's got some famous people in it, but it was still one of those like film convention movies that didn't get widely released in theaters. Mm-hmm. It's on iTunes, I think, for a couple bucks to rent. But it's my favorite Jack Black movie ever, for sure. He plays it kind of straight. So it's a funny movie, but he's not being like wacky and crazy comedy and stuff. But it's based on a true story of a small town mortician that was apparently the nicest man in the world that ended up murdering some little old lady, and it's really funny. It's a great movie. It's pretty awesome. So that's one of my picks. My other pick is I do like a video game pick every week. I'm doing another video game pick. Dota 2. It's a free-to-play game on Steam. It's a PC game. You control this hero and play with teammates to defeat this other team. It's super fun, and they just had this giant tournament a couple weeks ago with $1 million in prize money. The winning team got $750,000.
Wow.
So there are like lots of people playing, lots of people watching, and it was kind of scary to play at first because lots of people are really good at it, but they were very friendly, very welcoming community. So thumbs my picks.
Cool. Joe, what are your picks?
Okay, so first I read, I'm not sure if I picked this already, but I read a little series. It's a trilogy that's actually just a single novel broken up 3 times on Amazon.com. It's the Derrick Storm novels, written by the fictitious author Richard Castle, which is a fictitious author created in the show Castle. So while I'm at it, I'll pick the TV show Castle, which is awesome because it's about an author played by Nathan Fillion, and then this fictitious author has published now 6 or 7 books, and they're all really cool. So anyway, those Derrick Storm books, they're kind of like a little bit like Born, but very, very awesome books. Then the X-Wing miniatures game is coming out this week, so I'm going to pick that as well. And then I'm also going to pick PEX For Fun. That's PEXFORFUN.com. That's a sweet site I just discovered this week, and it's a Microsoft project, so don't hold that against them. And it's coding in C#, so another thing not to hold against them. But it's this website it pulls up, and it shows you a whole bunch it shows you one algorithm, and it just gives you an empty function with inputs, and you know what the inputs are and the return type. And for most of the ones, you can refresh the page and get different puzzles. But for each one, most of the time, you just don't know what the algorithm's trying to do. And so you just run it, and it'll tell you, all right, given these inputs, this is what the output should have been, whether or not your solution solved the problem correctly or not. And so you kind of have to just figure out what in the heck algorithm they're trying to get you to write. Like one of them was like an anagram, so put in a word and then to return a Boolean that tells whether or not the word is an anagram or not. And so closing in on that solution is just really fun. It's just some cool puzzles and really makes you think. So
do they just give you an input and an output, and you're supposed to figure out what the...
They give you a skeleton function that's got the inputs declared and the return type declared, and then you're supposed to fill it in the middle as to how to, based on the inputs, that's correct output. And then underneath it, it's just all on a web page, right? Underneath it, they show you, every time you ask it to run, it'll take different inputs and show you, all right, for this input, this is what the output should have been, and whether or not your solution that you have in the window is correct.
Right.
It's awesome. It's totally awesome.
Sounds cool.
Yeah, it's quite cool. They definitely need more implementations in other languages. So I want one more pick. That's the MLG Championship in Raleigh, North Carolina that happened a couple weeks ago. for the, I believe it was the Group C championship. There was this epic battle between Stefano and I can't remember the other guy. Do you remember the other guy's name, Jamison?
No, I didn't watch that one.
You still don't watch that one. You're a loser. Anyway,
I am a loser. I'm not up to date on my Starcraft 2 competitive.
It was this amazing 3-game series between these two Zerg players in Starcraft 2, Stefano and this other guy, and there was a 6-pool followed by another 8-pool game. It was fantastic. One of the best series I've ever seen in a Starcraft 2 series. So
MLG is Major League Gaming.
Yep, Major League Gaming.
I think I was never a huge sports fan, and I actually like sports more after I started watching esports. Like, I understand why people like sports more.
Yeah, competitive. Lots of fun. Cool. Any other picks?
Nope, that's it.
All right, so I guess it's my turn. I started working for this company last week. They're a client, not full-time. Anyway, actually it is full-time, and they're a client. Anyway, they're using Tmux and Emacs on these machines up in Amazon. And if you've used Tmux, you realize that when you connect to a Tmux session, whoever has the smallest window size, that is what Tmux resizes to. And so I had these dinky little monitors on here, and so every time I got on, it would resize to teeny tiny windows, and it made it kind of hard to do some of the work. And one of my monitors was decent, so I could kind of blow it up a little bit. But anyway, I ordered some new monitors, and anyway, the deal with the monitors is that they have the VESA 100 millimeter on the back. And my I have these desk mount arms. One of them's I think it's the LX desk mount. I'll put a link in the show notes. The other one is a little bit cheaper one that I got off of Amazon. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, because I honestly love having the stands or the arms for it. But anyway, you can get a converter for the VESA 75 millimeter to the VESA 100 millimeter, and it's just this plate with 8 holes in it. The 75 millimeter holes are threaded so that you can basically use the screws that you would use to mount your monitor on there to mount the plate on there, and then you just screw your monitor into the mount. So that's pretty cool. One other thing that I also bought that I'm totally loving is this Go Groove BlueSync Bluetooth wireless speaker. It has a USB plug-in, and it's really nice. The reason that I've been getting this stuff is because I have an old iPod 2nd generation, and it turns out that after you've had it for 3 or 4 years and you've used it as much as I have, the headphone jack tends to wear out. And so I thought about cracking it open and seeing if I could just solder it back together or find the loose connection in there somewhere, but I don't really want to open it up. So I just got these Bluetooth deals. So I got Bluetooth headphones, and I got this Bluetooth speaker that just sits on my desk, so I can listen to podcasts while I'm working. So I'll put links to all of that in the show notes. And those are my picks. All right, well then we'll just wrap the show up. Thanks to you guys for coming, and thanks everyone for listening.